Before I go into introduction, I want to give a commercial for our upcoming webinar series in February to continue the education and discussion based on what we were just listening to in our previous presentation. So all of our association members should have received a copy of Open Wide Our Hearts in the mail. And if you're an active member and you didn't receive that, please check to make sure that we have your updated information so that we can get that out to you. But moving forward, I am very excited to introduce our next speakers who I have experienced listening to before, and I know it's going to be great. Melanie Berdy-Hickey is at Briarcliff University, where she works with students in both the online and the campus Bachelor of Social Work programs. Prior to BCU, Melody worked at St. Jude Hospice, where she was Vice President of Mission, Ethics, and Benefits. Melanie holds a certification in Catholic Bioethics from the National Bioethics Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She's well-versed and has expertise in grief and bereavement. Her passions are gerontology practices and meeting the needs of the aging population. Linnea Anderson is a regional administrator for Hospice of the Midwest of Iowa and Minnesota. Her degrees include Bachelor of Social Work from Briarcliff University and Master of Social Work from the University of Iowa. She's a member of the National Association of Social Workers, Catholic Social Workers National Association, and holds certification in Catholic Bioethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Linnea has over 21 years experience in the field of hospice social work and hospice administration. In addition to delivering numerous presentations on hospice and grief-related issues in Iowa, Linnea founded Hearts and Hopes, a day and overnight camp for grieving children. I am very excited to welcome both Melanie and Linnea, and take it away.
Thank you all. This is Melanie, and I was on mute doing a whole presentation without knowing. So we're taking our pictures off just kind of to help out with some of the technological issues. And I do want to say thank you all for being a part of this. We appreciate your time and talents as you listen to our presentation, Cultural Lens and Spirituality as it relates to the ethics of the end of life. And you see, I have a little typo. I've done this presentation how many times, and I've never noticed that. So thank you for all for bearing with me. What is our objectives for today? You have us for quite a long time, for 2 hours. So within this 2 hours, we're hoping to get a few things accomplished. First of all, we hope that you all will have a better understanding of ethics as it relates to end-of-life care. And we will also have a better understanding of cultural sensitivity within the end-of-life care as it relates to being a Catholic. So when I say this, when I first got presented, or I was asked by the University of Iowa to do a co-presentation with a gal named Sarah Saunders, who I do use some of her slides. So I want to do a shout out to her. She's granted us permission in the past. With this, she asked me, she goes, Melanie, let's do the, so the University of Iowa asked us to do a presentation at Briarcliff University together. We do this every year. And as I thought about this, I said, Sarah, we have a lot of Catholic patients. I'm knowledgeable in this. Can we do something on cultural sensitivity, meaning Catholicism at the end of life? And she's like, let's go for it. Well, ironically, now the NASW here in the state of Iowa has really worked with us on the ability to teach this presentation to others. So Linnea and I will be teaching this presentation, a little bit, maybe even more Catholicism, because of the time, we'll have more time, but on Catholics as it relates to end-of-life care in Iowa. Our agenda really is to have an overview of ethics. How as Catholics do we work within the NASW? Cultural lens activity. We might have you do this all on your own a little bit if we have time. NASW cultural diversities and end-of-life documents, Catholic perspective, ERDs. And if you've heard us talk before, we really are a follower of these ERDs and an educator and such, and end-of-life documents. What does ethics mean to you? This is the question I ask all of my students and even my coworkers and even myself. What does it mean to us? I just want you to think a little bit where your stage of life is as an educator, as a practitioner, as a student. What does it mean to have ethics? And what are the stimuli that are bringing your ethics into your practice? And why does this discussion bring about emotions? I'm just talking with this in a slide, I can feel my emotions come out because of all the work that I've done, and I've done a lot of different hats within the social work field, many different agencies, because I'm older. I've worked over 25, 28 years in practice, and I just see my ethics becoming even stronger, maybe because I'm more knowledgeable within my practice, but it does bring about some raw emotions. Let's ponder a moment. Let's identify ethical challenges you face in end-of-life care. I want you to think a little bit. If you have worked in end-of-life care, as such, Rhonda does that, the previous presenter, how are we facing those ethical challenges? Or let's say you walked with somebody on a journey, how did they and you face that together? How are these related to boundaries and that possible dual relationship to the patients you are serving? What are those boundaries? Did you cross some boundaries? Or maybe you didn't know, but now after you've served those patients or served those friends, maybe you did. What are some of those questions that you could ask yourself from some of those challenges? And I say this in deep, thought process. My dad died 12, 13 years ago. And I identified so many ethical challenges from the MSW that was serving him, but also within myself, a MSW at the time. And then also a daughter of someone who was facing those challenges. And to this day, I have raw feelings for that social worker because she, I feel, did not do justice for my father. And ironically, my mom had a stroke a few weeks back. And we were in the hospital, the same hospital that served my dad. And ironically, that conversation came up by a nurse who served my father and said, I always wanted to talk to you about this, because it was such an ethical dilemma, and she felt so horrible. She talked to me, and she remembered that even 13 years later. All right, so Linnea and I we kind of like drew straws on who said this, who got this presentation of this slide. Because if you work in end-of-life care and healthcare, sometimes some of these words are hard to say. So if I stumble, I do apologize, but I'm the lucky one that was able to talk about ethics in end-of-life care as it relates to these terms. Non-maleficence, dignity of the human person, autonomy, justice, beneficence, and truth-telling. We're gonna go into a little bit of details about each. What is non-maleficence? First of all, in healthcare, you do no harm. That is our ultimate goal. You do no harm to that patient or the patient's family that you're serving. You look for those best options. Sometimes those options are not in front of you. You have to have those team meetings or IDG meetings. You have to look between all the professionals and say, what can we do for this patient? I also work for Mercy and home health care in the clinical section to keep my clinical work going up. And so even just the other day, like, I need help. So reaching out to professionals, doctors, it just so helped me to, first of all, do no harm to this client and do it as fast. And then we talk about the principle of double effect. I will have to do some disclosure here. I'm not at all an expert on this principle, but as I received my certification, we did learn about the principle of double effect. And any time that I have questions, I do reach out to a priest, a deacon, I do reach out to more professionals on such. But we're going to talk a little bit about this next. This principle governs situations in which one action is followed by two effects. One is good and intended, and the other evil, foreseen but not intended. Examples, the easiest example I say is cervical cancer while being pregnant. I mean, that is one that is used throughout books, literature, and such. But the one that we're going to concentrate, and I want you to think about this as we go through the next slides, is end-of-life pain medications. So when I was doing some research last night with the Catholic Guide to End-of-Life Decision-Making document, they use this as an example. And I'm going to go through these documents at the end of the presentation. But it talks about using pain medication as a part of end-of-life care. And when is medication gone too far that could hasten death? Or when is the pain so unbearable that you can start using some medication? The principal double effect manual for practitioners is the National Bioethics Center. And that is where Lydia and I both got our education. So I have a couple of these manuals in my office at home. I've given to family members. I think they're nice and gift, but I'm not trying to sell them, but it just really helps understand ethics for end-of-life care. And the NCBC right here, and this is, if you're familiar with the NCBC, this is what the website looks like. But really, it talks about those 4 principles, and I'm going to go through next. Principle double factor. We have principle 1. The action is good in itself. The action itself must be for the good of the patient. So this medication that you're using, is it good for the patient because they're in so much pain? And if you work with individuals at the end of life, or even in the healthcare setting, you might have known a patient that they're in such excruciating pain. And you walk in there and you're like, what can we do to help this pain? And you can feel their pain, both spiritually, emotional, physical, all that pain. And how are we going to help them and guide them through these decision-making processes? And there's certain cancers that cause excruciating pain. And if you've seen that, it kind of can bring kind of some raw emotions. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. The second principle, the bad effect is only foreseen. The intention of the patient is for good moral effect. Caring for the patient must be good in nature, not subjected to those actions. The third one, no evil means to a good end. The good effect must not be brought about by the means of the bad effect. And number 4, proportionate reasons. The effect must not exceed the good. And sometimes this is where I really struggle. I'm like, how can we be doing this? And that's right, again, this is a team approach. You get your spiritual directors, you get your priests, your deacons, bishops, ethicists, whatever it may be involved. And that's why there's ethicists and ethic review boards for most healthcare settings. The goal is to preserve the good and health of the patient. Let's talk about dignity of the human person. And we heard about this yesterday in Sydney's and in the presentation before us, that dignity of that human person. Social workers respect that all people have the right to services in caring and respectful fashion. You may not agree with their actions, you may not agree with how they're living, but we must respect them as a human person. Because that is, even as Ray said, we have to earn those respect from our children as well. So and I'm a parent of a 17-year-old who has 20 girls outside right now taking pictures of her dance team. I'm respecting her space, but I also, all those girls respected our house while I do presentation. Because we have dignity that human person, we have to respect each other, respect our clients, as well as we need to have respect too. As Catholics, each person is made in the likeness and image of God. This seems so easy to me, but then I look at so many times, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like the hardest topic to even think about sometimes. Each person is made in the likeness and image of God. So what does God look like to me? But when I walk down the street, and I work in multiple, I work in Africa, I work in multiple different hats. I'm working with an organization in Africa. And when I went to Africa a couple years ago and plan to go again this summer, that likeness and image of God, I walked off that plane into this village, into this orphanage. I literally, and I'm still getting goosebumps to this day, I just wanted to cry because this is my vision of God. These little orphans, absolutely just loving every minute that they have in life, and they're projecting this onto me. that likeness and image of God. I look at my children and saying, oh my gosh, that likeness and image of God. I look at my neighbors down the street, my neighbors, people that I serve on Briar Cliff campus, likeness and image of God. What does this look like if someone does not have that spiritual relationship though? How do I work with that individual and still have boundaries? Or how do we educate our students, because I'm an educator, on what that really means? Autonomy and self-determination. This is the principle that respects other self-determination. How many times have we looked at someone and like, oh my gosh, you're going back to him, he's abusing you. Or at the end of life, this was me, Dad decided not to continue chemotherapy. We feel chemotherapy he was one of those ones that was actually killing him. And that once he stopped chemo, his life, just his ability to live longer and be on hospice, and just his quality of life was so much enhanced when his chemo was stopped. But we knew when his chemo was stopped that his life would not be prolonged as could be with chemo. But I respected that right, and it was hard. It was hard for even months after his death. My mom really, was a part of that decision-making as well, and she really helped him look at the benefits versus the burdens, and she lived with him every day. And finally, we all came as a family, and we had to respect that, but that was his self-determination. We wanted him to fight harder. We wanted him to fight longer. But within itself, that was his decision, and that was selfishly on my end as a daughter to even ask him to do that. Instead, we took his pain and passion and love for redemptive suffering. At the time, I didn't know what that was, and walked along with him. And this is where sometimes the NASW versus the Catholic healthcare can be very controversial, sometimes not complementary, but sometimes complementary. So when we look at the NASW, self-determination, think of that in your clinical work or in work, whatever work you may do. How can that be contradictory? I mean, you look at how some view image and likeness of God may be different than we as Catholics view image and likeness of God. So I choose to work in Catholic healthcare to kind of have the validation that I know that sometimes I won't have to make some of those ethical decisions or be a part of those decision-making processes. It's kind of like my insurance for that. But I also follow the NASW because I am an educator, I am a social worker licensed in several states, and they complement each other in so many ways. So I tell my students, if you at some point in your life feel that this job could really go against your moral standards, really think this is a place you're gonna need to work. Now, I also say, I live in rural Iowa. There is not many jobs out there, and if there is, they're begging for social workers because we don't have enough social workers. And we all follow the NASW if we're licensed. So you have to really pick and choose where those boundaries and those ethical considerations are going to be that may go against your religion or your spirituality. Now let's look at justice. Social workers are to challenge social justice. This is my passion. I love challenging because as I challenge, I also grow. And many times I fail, and I do presentations on failure. I fail so many times per day. And I tell my students, it's important sometimes to just reach out there, get yourself into those challenges, even with burning social justice, whatever you feel that passion is. Because we need to advocate rights for all. And many times we'll be set back, and we'll just have to, like I tell my daughter to suck it up. You have to be able to go back out there. You have to do, because you feel such passion for this. But many times that passion can be skewed by raw emotions. So we have to kind of get back, let some supervision happen, and really work toward that justice for all. We look at fairness and equality to access all options for best outcomes. So this kind of goes back to the previous ethics presentation. We must look at each individual, and it's so important that as healthcare practitioners, that we are acknowledging that there could be there are discrepancies in where healthcare is being offered, how it's being offered and such. And if we are a part of that system, how are we going to advocate for that? That's social justice, advocating for rights for all, good healthcare for everyone, and be fair about it. And I know when I went to Santiago, Chile, and we were doing some healthcare work out there, the discrepancy because of socioeconomic. I was right next to somewhere, a private hospital, beautiful. I could not afford the healthcare there. And so we were discussing, if I got sick, this is how much I can pay. They said, oh no, you couldn't go here. You would have to go elsewhere. Well, then we visited that hospital. It was very nice as well, clean, but the waiting line was incredibly long. And I was like, wow, this is different, that injustice. And again, that was in a different country, but I was visually able to see it and experience it. The principle requires that healthcare professionals put their patients' best interests ahead of their own decisions regarding actions toward other patients. This can be hard and challenging. And so and this is a hard and challenging word to say. So it's important that we also look at that principle for healthcare professionals. Truth telling, informed consent, and Linnea, if you ever want to kind of pipe in here, because I know you have some really good stories about this one, but in my healthcare, in my journey with the VPM mission, I had to educate a lot about how it's so important to allow the patient, if it doesn't cause undue harm, that they're absolutely aware of their disease progression. They are aware that they are fine because it gives them the opportunities to make their choices for best outcomes for them for their end of life journey. Many times we'll get children, our caregivers saying, please take that hospice sign or your tag that says hospice off. And I say, but it's why? And please wear different clothing because I don't want them to know that they're dying. But they have the right to know. Now, I will say there are circumstances that sometimes knowing that will cause undue stress, especially with dementia, Alzheimer's, some of that can just cause undue stress. And yes, you have to team that and make those decisions. But this concept reminds each of us to allow patients and clients to be told what is necessary to help them make appropriate decisions for those best outcomes. It is their right to have full knowledge of their care.
Oh, and I was just going to mention with that, a lot of times people, when you mention dementia, a lot of times they will talk about dementia. And for instance, somebody whose husband passed away years ago, but they keep wondering where their husband is. Again, you look at that as, is it doing more harm to that person to continually remind them that their husband has passed? Or is there another conversation that needs to be made?
And I thank you for saying that because, I've worked with a lot of individuals who continuously ask, when's my husband coming back? Or, they never were allowed to go through the threshold.
What I couldn't figure out this morning is how to get out of it.
Oh, I think someone else is on, so that's okay though. That is totally okay. But it's important that too is like going to the funeral, finding closure. It's just going to be too hard for mom to go to that funeral. Sometimes it is physically too hard. They're bedridden, they're not able to go. You need to hire someone, financially can't do that. But it's important though that there is closure. And even with people with Alzheimer's and dementia, there's so many different forms of dementia, that closure is actually something that they might have the ability to process. But it's every individual. We must look at every individual and even sometimes have to care for that. So Linnea, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Wonderful, thanks, Melanie. So we're going to talk now about end of life and boundaries. And so I'd encourage you to think about what end of life care looks like to you. And to everyone, it looks differently. I encourage all of our staff to think about what it looks like for them because it may not be what it looks like for our patients and families. So again, all those things are really important as we talk about end of life and what we want our end of life to look like so that we can prepare. So there is a book, and if you don't have it and you like end of life, I would really encourage you to get it. It is called The Handbook of Thanatology. It's the essential body of knowledge for the study of death, dying, and bereavement. And it is a wonderful book that encapsulates many issues at the end of life. It talks about lifespan issues, it talks about ethics, it talks about religious and spirituality as it relates to loss, grief, and mourning, legal issues. So lots of different things in this book that really helps us to care for those, not only patients at the end of life, but also those that are bereaved. So the 5 principles of end of life care are the 5 principles that we talk about in our company at orientation and throughout the time that people are with us, because it's really important at the end of life, or really any type of social work that we are doing, that we are adhering to our ethics. We're adhering to our beliefs. We're adhering to all of those things that foundationally made us who we are as social workers. So the first is the rule of abstinence. And this is really the foundation upon which the other principles rest. Working with dying and bereaved is very personally gratifying to us as professionals, because we're really offering support at a time when it's really needed. And most of the time, those people are wanting us to be in their home. They're wanting us to provide that care. So it's something that they really want. And so when we talk about the rule of abstinence, any gratification for the caregiver should come accurately with the understanding and appropriately meeting the needs of that person, right? We want to meet their needs. We can't fill our needs by taking that away from that patient or family. So we want to make sure that when we are seeing our patients, when we are seeing our clients, that, you know, we're not going to be gratified at their expense, right? We get so much from the work that we do. I always say they give me way more than I ever put in. And it really should be that, you know, we're not being personally gratified at their expense. You know, we're not changing that the patient or the caregiver is taking care of us instead of us taking care of them. In hospice, you know, we often develop relationships, and hospice has been my cornerstone. I have worked in hospital systems, I've worked with kids and families, but the primarily spot in which my professional career has been in hospice. And many times, you know, we have patients that we might have for a long period of time, and we have times in which we have people for short periods of time. And I'm sure that in any social work practice, you all have experienced times where crisis brings people maybe closer together, and it also can exacerbate a little bit of those differences in coping styles, or it can bring out long-standing family conflicts. And oftentimes as professionals, you know, we're lending that therapeutic ear, and we're trying to help them to maybe make some decisions and listen to them. Sometimes that can also kind of grow into a role where we don't want to be, where we become kind of that chosen one, that confident, the only one that understands. So it's really important that we be an active listener, that we provide that emotional support, but we don't want to step into a position in which we can't be neutral, right? We want to be available for those people. We want to be available for those social supports and the family members. But again, you know, we are there to kind of be that facilitator and help them make those decisions. When we talk about the promotion of patient autonomy and self-determination, so you'll see that some of these principles will coincide with the NASW or our Catholic social workers group. I mean, there's a lot of these that kind of coincide with each other, but when we talk about that promotion of self-autonomy and self-determination, it's really important that, not many people, I shouldn't say no one, not many people want to be dependent upon other people. So it's important that we recognize people's strength and competence regardless of their physical decline. And we want them to feel important. So even, if you can't pick up the glass, but I can pick up the glass for you and you can, suck that water through a straw, that's what we want to do. If you can pick up that glass, but you can't get up to get it, I want to put it within reach so that you can get it. So those little things, we want our patients to be as independent as they can be, not as dependent as they can be. This is about families, what types of things can we do to help them to know and make them feel good about all of this care that they're providing. We also talk about the fiduciary relationship. And what that is that, it mandates that we provide that standard of care. It also looks at, some patients pay directly for service, some are paid indirectly through Medicare, Medicaid, private insurances, but they did pay for that service. So they paid for that expertise, they pay for that contracted relationship. And many times I assume maybe there's some people from hospice on here, and in other aspects of social work that we do, you'll hear people say, well, it's kind of like we're part of the family. And that can be a little slippery slope, right? So we want to just be careful that you can be compassionate and loving and love the people that you're serving, and not be their family. A family is, somebody that's there 24 hours a day and caring for them and has known them for years upon years. So something that we have to be a little careful of. And then again, the respect. This to me is huge, so very huge. And whether we're talking about diversity, culture, just being a good person, the respect for human dignity is by far one of the biggest things that we talk about, that we don't have to believe the same things to just be respectful of someone's dignity, of their culture, of their views, and of their belief system. So we move on to what are boundaries. Boundaries are really that edge of appropriate behavior. They're those lines that draw what our role is and what our interactions, what our relationships are. And guys, this is our job as social workers to define those roles. It is not the role of our patients or our clients. It is our role to make sure that we define those boundaries and that we create that atmosphere of safety and predictability for our patients and our families and our clients. So, those are really our responsibility to do that. Now, boundaries can be geographic and emotional space, distance space. It's not just the physical space that we always need to look at. We also look at that contract for that service relationship. I can't imagine that any of you, have never had a time in which somebody calls you and says, I'm running late. And then I'm running actually 2 hours late, but I'll see you in 2 hours. And maybe you have another client in 2 hours or another patient in 2 hours. Do you push off that other patient because this client was late? What do you do in those types of circumstances? And then also making sure that we keep those expectations moving forward. So I'm assuming that some of you have children and grandchildren where you've been to, the sports night where the coach identifies the expectations of the season, right? Again, if they don't uphold those expectations, then everybody kind of runs them up. So again, we want to look at expectations and keeping that professional and personal boundary, and also not bringing our own issues into our patients' home or our clients' home. Our business is not their business. And again, that's where sometimes that role will shift, where we will see the patient, client, or family begin to take care of the staff member versus, vice versa, the staff member taking care of them. They have many things going on at the end of life, which probably are maybe a little bit more impactful than what's possibly going on in their life. So when we talk about boundaries at the end of life, we want to keep in check that, especially in hospice and in many other healthcare destinations, so to speak, our services that we're providing to our patients, we're providing to patients that are very vulnerable. They may be in crisis. They may be in need of additional support. And so many times what we are doing is really providing that care to a very vulnerable person. And they may be very susceptible to anything that we say in proceeding with something that we say or something that we want them to do. And when people are experiencing life crisis, there is that shared meeting, and there's lots of experiences that we all have throughout our entire lives of serving people in one avenue or whatever avenue we're serving them in, where we may use some examples from time to time. And again, that's okay if it's important for the growth of that patient or family, or to set their mind at ease. But again, we want that to make sure that that's pertinent. We want to make sure that we're also looking at what types of things are we going to need to do for our patients and families in order for them to feel comfortable, in order for them to continue to share that life meaning with us, and how do we have and create the atmosphere to have those conversations with them. So what I'd like to do now is have you think about what are boundaries? What are they? How do we set them? What do they look like? And oftentimes people will say to me, well, in order to have good boundaries, you just have to if it is not structured, you just say no. Well, I mean, it could be, or maybe there's a slight different version that we could use. Do boundaries have anything to do with geographical space or emotional space? Do they have anything to do with patients' unstated expectations? Do they have anything to do with contract for services, for role identification or personal relationships? What about our power? Do any of you think you have power when you're going in and seeing your clients, your patients, or your families? We definitely have an unstated power, right? But do we acknowledge that? And how do we acknowledge that? And do we acknowledge the vulnerability of the patient? So boundaries have so many different connotations that we could look at. So why do we worry about boundaries? Well, there's lots of reasons why we worry about boundaries. Boundaries, if we don't have good boundaries, it can not only be hurtful to ourselves, but also to our patients and families. So when we look at people impacted by our boundaries and the management of our boundaries, as well as those dual relationships and conflicts of interest that can come in, you can see there's many people that can impact, right? Including ourselves. And I think Melanie, and just talking about dual relationships and those types of things that happen, as we are, I also live in a very small town, about 1,500 people. So the odds of me having a dual relationship as a social worker are pretty high, right? The odds of me being the only social worker providing care in the hospice that we serve, that's in our town here, probably pretty high that I may serve a family member a close family friend. I may have to get my oil changed by the only place in town that changes oil, right? So, you know, there are those times when those dual relationships in rural areas can be conflicting and cumbersome, but they do happen. And again, it's all in how we as professionals are working with those dual relationships or those professionals.
Linnea, I just want to add a little story here. Back, when I was young, just right out of my bachelor's level, I was talking about boundaries, and I still to this day. And I have moved a lot, so I'm not going to breach confidentiality, but someone told me something so deep and wrong about something they did, and they were Catholic, and they asked if this is appropriate to go to confession, and I gave, I said, I really can't give my opinion on that, that's up to you. And they were so thankful that I was neutral on that, but they told me something, and I honestly, I travel a lot, I move a lot. One day, I went to church, and there they were, sitting in the same pew as me, and it was Easter. The person's eyes got huge, and I just continued singing because I knew something about this individual, and I know most of you out there are therapists, that you know the most raw emotions that these individuals have. But in this dual relationship, I ended up being in the same parish as them, and I never ever said anything to her, or even tried to build a relationship we were even in a little group together, and it was, we were placed there by people who didn't even know we had this relationship. And she came to me one day in the bathroom and just said, thank you for just being you. And I'm like, what does that mean? And that's what she meant, that dual relationship. And she said, still to this day, you're the only person that knows, and I appreciate you. Just seeing you that day in church was like a miracle to me, because I knew that you actually cared, and you cared about God. And so that was her likeness and image. But it was just something that those boundaries can happen. I mean, most of you, if you're from Ohio, there's such a rural area of Ohio, right? And there's such a rural area in Iowa, Colorado. I know there's people from all over the United Texas. Kathleen is from Texas. It is so hard not to have these dual relationships, especially in those areas. So, but how you deal with them and express yourself in those outwards.
Thank you, Melanie. Yes, very, very important. And it happens so frequently, more than not. You bring up a great point as we talk, kind of moving in here to boundary crossing and violations, just that, there are just several times where you're going to be walking in the mall, or you're going to be at church, or you're going to be in those places. And my rule of thumb is I never approach someone unless they approach me. And it's because you just don't ever know. And I wouldn't want anybody to feel bad if I didn't approach them. So, I'm gonna make eye contact with them and give them a smile or a look if that's something that it looks like or feels like I can do. But it is really hard in those situations, because I never want somebody to feel like I don't acknowledge them, but I don't want to acknowledge them if they don't want me to acknowledge them, because, when you live in a small town, like, your business is everybody's business, right? They know when you leave the light on in the bathroom or downstairs. So that's a great point. Thanks, Melanie, for sharing that.
And I as I think about this, again, in small town at the end of life, there is such raw emotion at the end of life, and I will have families come up to me. Again, I worked in hospice almost all over the state of Iowa and parts of Nebraska and Kansas, and I in Iowa here, I'll have people come up to me or find me on Facebook and say, and this is the anniversary of my mom's death. I always, said something like, oh, I'm so still thinking of you. And then I say a prayer if I knew that they, at the time, most of the time can remember. But those raw emotions bring about such impact, and acknowledging them. And this is when sometimes that boundary, where is it a violation crossing, or is it a violation, or even responding to them. Because I don't want to build that relationship, but I also want them to know that as a practitioner, I do care about them. And I do care because that caring didn't stop right at death. And bereavement is my passion, because I needed bereavement after my father died. I need bereavement after I had my miscarriage. I need bereavement when, there's other life situations happen. And if those people that help me, if they would just ignore me, when I approach them, it would hurt me deeply. So it's important that, as we look, and that I know I have students on here, that we look at each individual as that circumstance and how we do each case differently. Because I've also had people, we have a Fairway in our town, we're from Iowa, and that's the only place to shop for groceries. And I'll see people that maybe I've worked in a different capacity that absolutely they don't want to have any association with me, because they know then if somebody knows, then they'll know, oh, they're part of that agency. So there's different aspects, but it's so important to keep that autonomy.
Absolutely. So you talk a little bit about boundary crossings and violations, and when we do our boundary in servicing, we talk a lot about boundary crossings are kind of like brief excursions, across the lines. They're kind of, inadvertent. Most of the time they're harmless. They're, nobody's looking to exploit anything. I mean, they're just, it's kind of one of those things where you do something, you're like, afterwards you're like, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. And sometimes too, there may be a portion of it that's possibly supportive to the therapy. But they are kind of those little things that happen that you're like, boy, I don't know. Maybe that wasn't kind of what I was supposed to do, or maybe it has some implications or some consequences, but they're not dire, right? They're not something that's a big deal. I spent a couple hours with a family last Saturday, and it was a good, very close family friend of ours I had actually worked with her. She's had Parkinson's for probably 10 years. Husband's been taking care of her for the last 4 years. She's been completely dependent upon cares for probably the past 2 years. And, going in and talking with them and knowing things that I already know that maybe he doesn't know, or, those sometimes become little tricky situations of, how do you cross, how do you have these conversations, losing the trust of that other person, when you know some things that maybe, that person, that husband, that spouse doesn't know that right? So, those are those times where you kind of have to stop and think about what you're saying and how you're saying it, so that it ends up being helpful to both parties. Now, a boundary violation is something that is harmful, right? Or potentially harmful. It's oftentimes it's going to exploit the patient or the family, and it oftentimes has the development of harmful consequences. And again, I talked a little bit before about our power, about seeing patients in a very vulnerable state. So, whether it's hospice or you're doing therapy of whatever sorts, we can really kind of impose our own thoughts and feelings and belief systems on these very vulnerable people. And to think that there aren't people that do that, we'd be pretty naive. And there are a couple of situations that have happened in my 2-year hospice that kind of make me wonder what in the world is going on, right? I have had, thank goodness, no social workers, but I did have a nurse that became involved with a patient's husband. It was a young patient that we had that was dying of cancer, became involved with that patient's husband during the time that the patient was dying, and then ended up marrying the spouse about 3 months after the patient died, and that nurse no longer has a nursing license. That's a boundary violation, right? Whether you're a nurse or a social worker. So, this stuff happens pretty frequently. We hear about, financial exploitation, sexual exploitation. These things happen a lot more than we want them to ever happen. And I encourage all of our people, all of our staff to, and even as professionals, and Melanie and I have had the privilege of working together in hospice. And we've had the privilege of working together in management. And there are times where we have to hold each other accountable and say, hey, have you thought about this? Or do you think this is, maybe crossing the line? And as professionals, we have to help each other out, because sometimes when we're in the thick of it, we don't really, maybe see that implication that's happening, or something that may be happening or could be happening soon. So I don't know, Melanie, if you have any other thoughts about boundary crossing and violations, but these are.
Okay, I do. One more example, and this is like a funny example, but it wasn't funny at the time. But now I think back and I laugh. And I was working with a patient as bereavement. His wife died. And they had a dog together, and the dog was such a cute dog. And at the time, I was looking for a dog, and we did end up finding a really cute dog to have as part of our family. And I must have said to this man, I really like your dog. And you know what? This is the kind of dog I must look for, which we ended up not getting. Again, I used personal information. Well, he ended up getting on our services and died. The daughter called me about 2 months after the fact and said, hi, I want you to know that my dad changed his will at the very end of his life and willed you his dog. I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And we would have accepted this dog into our home, no problem, just because we're dog people and it is what it is. But when I was like, okay, one, I did a boundary. I was crossing the boundaries of talking about myself, but I was trying to help him and know that, kind of find something similar to talk about, because they had dog pictures everywhere. But then if I would have, I personally said, I can't take this dog, it'd be a violation of my ethics. And over the phone, they could tell her sigh was like, oh my gosh, they wanted you to have this dog. So I did find somebody to take the dog. That dog, I think is still living, because I see pictures on Facebook. But a nurse ended up taking, who did not care for this individual, but really wanted a dog and lived down the road and knew this dog, and the family could visit it, and it was just so perfect. But because I was so nervous, they willed the dog to me. What do you do with that? How do you say no to that? But I did have to say no, because it would have been something that I shouldn't have done. And I know that sounds kind of like, oh, really? But I got consultation on this. They're like, no, just part of our policy at work is you do not accept gifts. And, and to that day, I really am careful what I say to people at the end of life. And because I never thought in a million years that we ever willed a dog. And I even called my attorney. I'm like, what do I do? And he goes, well, find a home for it. And so, and then I got some consultation from other social workers. And they're like, yeah, you need to find another home or help the family find a home, in which we did. It took a while, but it was in foster care, and it was doing well. But it was just something so simple, but became such a huge issue for me.
Thank you. The other thing I want to mention before we move on is with boundary crossing, the other thing is it does impact not only our patients and yourself, but also your team. So, whether that is that you do private practice, obviously that's more impactful than to you and your client. But if you're working in a team environment such as hospice or other, hospital systems where you have a team of people and you're crossing those boundaries, another example that I could give is that, people that give out their cell phone numbers. Yeah, you know what? We want to be accessible. Everybody wants to be accessible until they don't want to be accessible. I tell my peeps, if you're going to give your cell phone out, you better be ready to answer that phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week when you're on vacation, right? Because you set that boundary then that it's okay for them to give you a call on your cell phone versus calling the office. So those are some things you want to think about. We had an instance where we had a nurse give out her cell phone number, and the family called the nurse cell phone, and she was on vacation, her phone was off. The patient didn't call, family called because the patient had died. And so, this is sitting in her inbox of her voicemail, and the patient has passed away, and nobody knows it. So, there's all those little implications. And again, by no means was she trying to do any harm, right? By giving out her cell phone number. She wanted to be accessible to them. But again, if you're gonna be that accessible, then you have to, be accessible. So think about those types of things, and boundaries are a big thing that oftentimes as clinicians, as managers, as social workers, we assume people know what boundaries are. So assuming isn't going to help us create boundaries. We want to make sure that we create those so that we don't have those boundary crossings or violations that are going to impact the care that we provide. So we want to look a little bit now at the CSWNA and talk about, how all of this comes together, right? We've got all of these different entities kind of saying, hey, social workers, this is what you got to do, right? And then we take that information and we want to be able to look at this stuff through different lenses, right? Because that's what we do. We have to be so competent in so many different areas of the work that we do, of the people that we see, of the cultures that we're in, of the rural areas, the metro areas that we're in, that we have to be able to learn and empower ourselves, not only through the directives that we're given, but also through that spiritual lens. And I think that one of the things that I have loved about the CSWNA is the progression that we have in really looking at our Catholic faith structure and the outline for good, excellent ethics. How we can kind of marry everything together so that we are continuing to not only, fill us up, so to speak, but fill up our spiritual cup, right? We've got all sorts of cups, I think, in our brains and our bodies, right? So we want to fill up that spiritual cup, again, by doing the right thing with the right information, making those best choices with the information that we have. The other thing with the CSWNA is the increase of our education, right? I mean, gosh, we had education yesterday, we have education today, tomorrow. We have our little inserts that we're doing, once a month. Again, as opportunities for all of us to continue to be, to enhance, I would say, our knowledge about being a Catholic social worker. So we're going to go over some of the responsibilities and thoughts within the CSWNA. And so I'm not going to read through all of these. I would encourage you to look at these as we go through. But one of the things that always strikes me as the corner post again is the fundamental dignity of worth of all persons. Of all persons. We've had different facets today, yesterday, of people talking about different issues, whether it's self-care from yesterday, diversity today, culture here, as Melanie will talk about a little bit later. But again, fundamental dignity. And I pause when I say that because I think oftentimes, that is just brushed over, right? I mean, yeah, sure, we have dignity for all people. Okay, but do we have fundamental dignity? Do we take the time to display, to really embrace the worth of all human persons? from conception to natural death. So when I think about human dignity and I think about the worth of all persons, I think about that informed consent. I think about, are we meeting people the way that we need to meet them so that they feel loved, that they feel that they can talk about the issues that they have? Do they feel that they can get some loss of words right now? Do they feel like that we can help them when maybe they have done something that is not in our beliefs, in their belief system, and maybe has went against their values? Is there some room in there for them to have that space to acknowledge the teaching of the church, to have that professional and spiritual growth in those times where, maybe we could have made a different decision or should have made a decision differently. So how do we foster that personal growth, that professional growth, and still come out the way it needs to come out, so to speak?
And Lene, when we work with the end of life, we hear a lot of stories. And these are situations where they just want to tell somebody, and they may not be Catholic, they may be Catholic, they may not, the end of life rituals, they may want, family may not want. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But we are there, and they're like telling us. I know you have as well, because we share what do we do with this? So many possible decisions that they made throughout their lifetime, and they know that they're dying, and they know that they have to get this off their chest, and they trust us even sometimes more than they do that chaplain, because it might not be that, my relationship might not be there. So in how we react, our nonverbals and our verbals, how we react to those comments is that humanity part as well. And again, I've failed many times in that situation, but I've also grown through every time that I've had to deal with someone telling me that they had multiple affairs, or they have a child from another woman that no one knows about, or they've had multiple abortions, or things like that. And how we react is so important as well.
Very much so. It's also really important, that we're adhering to the federal and state statutes regarding our duty to report, that we're providing that accountability for what we do, that we are trying to combat any injustice that's happening based on age, gender, race, religion, color, disability, or sexual orientation. We want to advocate. We always want to be good advocates, right? Because by doing that, we are able to help and uphold the rights of others, their attitudes, their opinions, even though they may be different from ours. But really looking for that opportunity to help those out in the community, in our profession, and in our church. When we look at our clients and what our responsibilities are to our clients or to our patients, that we do provide those services within appropriate boundaries, right? We shouldn't be doing things that are outside of our scope. We shouldn't be practicing outside of our scope. We should look for opportunities in which we can help those that are needing our help. And if we're not the right person, we need to get them to the right person. We want to make sure that our clients and our patients are informed, that they know their right to confidentiality, but also the limits to confidentiality. If you're going to tell me you're going to hurt someone, I can't not do anything about that, right? So there are some limits to that confidentiality. We also want to look at, what that privacy and confidentiality looks like. And again, we've had some examples of how, and actually when I worked for a hospice before, we used to have cars that were logoed, right? So when I drive into their driveway, right, everybody knows why I'm there. But even in a small town, If I drive into somebody's driveway that I wouldn't normally drive into, right? They're not my friend, not necessarily my friends or acquaintances, but there's an assumption that, oh, Mrs. Jones must be going on hospice. I saw Linnea Anderson's car there today. And you know, everybody's probably talking about it at the coffee shop. So again, there's a lot of those things when we talk about boundaries and even our responsibilities to clients that we truly try to do, but the nature of the job sometimes kind of alludes to if they do invite us in, there may be somebody that sees something that they might say something about that. And I know that that's probably happened to Melanie too, because she had the same logo car. But it is hard in these rural areas that, you know, oftentimes starts a little bit of chatter. Or they know that Mrs. Jones is on hospice. They know that you work for hospice and don't maybe realize that there are hundreds, thousands of different hospices. But how is Mrs. Jones doing? Again, not something that we can talk about. So we want to make sure that we also declare any conflicts of interest. And these can be really small or they can be really big, but it is important that we talk about that. When we admit someone that is a close family friend of ours, I let our team know that, you know, hey, these are people that I know, that I talk with on a weekly basis, on a daily basis. I want you to be aware of that. Because odds are if there's a problem, they're probably going to be calling me, but I do want them to know that I do know those people. And I think one of the big things too, when I talk about, or when we look about the responsibilities to our patients is, it's really our responsibility to build that solid relationship, to promote that self-determination, to be aware of any cultural or religious individual differences. That is our job. That is our accountability to our patients and our clients. It's our way to promote that greaterness for them, to look for those opportunities to help them in whatever aspect it is that we need to help them with. And if we need to gain access, whether that's, you know, language, cultural sensitivity, hours, or underserved populations, we need to do that. We need to figure out how to get that done. But we also need to provide that appropriate transfer of termination for our patients or clients and respect their identity. And that's a lot of different things that we do. To our responsibilities of our clients, the responsibilities of our communities, is that we just really have to, again, respect the identity of people. The human identity encapsulates religion and encapsulates culture, it encapsulates belief systems. So again, we're bringing all that together to just be able to be good people. Just be good people. Just respect other people. And look for those opportunities to kind of awaken issues that you see. To talk about, you know, what types of issues are we seeing? Are we seeing that there is an unjust or you know, discrimination towards, you know, gender or religion? Do we see that? And being able to know that we should be able to bring that up in a place of which we talk with our supervisor, we talk with our colleagues about that. We also want to make sure that we promote that honesty, that we promote that understanding with appropriate boundaries, with our supervisory roles, and look for the opportunity to seek out, do we need that consultation? The NCBC is a great place to consult. You know, talking to your other Catholic social work colleagues, you know, there's all sorts of ways that we can consult to get the right information or to help work through something that we're really struggling with.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural sensitivity and cultural sensitivity pertaining to the Catholic faith at the end of life. So with the help of Linnea, we're going to kind of walk through some of the NASW, but also some information that's especially my students, our students and practitioners that may not know of these documents, but also consultation. When Linnea was talking about the NCBC, I've used them several times with patients, especially at the end of life. And the family, you know, asks, where do we go? How do we make these decisions about maybe pain management, or should not do artificial feeding? What about a breathing tube, something like that, a peg tube? What do we do? And, you know, they go to their priest, they maybe didn't get the answers they wanted to hear or thought they should hear. So we have, I've done referrals plenty of times to the NCDC. It's been a great, you know, service, and I just want to throw that out there. And I know that there's other agencies as well. Again, this is what Linnea and I have been educated in. Okay, so I want y'all to think. I mean, again, we if we could, we'd break out in rooms, but we're not going to do that. But think, just write a quick definition of culture for yourself. If you're able to do this, if you have a piece of paper, use your phone. You know, I always tell my students, I allow my phone usage in my classroom just because of this. If you don't know the definition of culture, go ahead and look it up. If you can't pronounce it, you can push a button and it'll pronounce it for you. So write a quick definition of culture. What does that mean to you? And then I want you to just think or write down as many cultures as you can. When I was at the University of Iowa starting my bachelor's program, I was very sheltered. And I say this because I lived in a very white, farming Catholic community in a little town of Elgona, Iowa. And I was shocked when the first week when I was in my rhetoric class, it was Rhetoric 101, and I was the only white person in my class. There was another person, and she, at the end, I was like, I couldn't figure out what her culture was. It was the best group I've ever encountered, and we call it a group because it was a class. But I learned so much about different religions, cultures, races in that class, even though it was all about writing. And so I was able to find my folder. I keep all my folders from all the classes I've ever taken, because you never know when you need that syllabus, right? That syllabi. And so it was interesting what I wrote about at that time, and it was mainly about that gal, and she helped me learn so much about her African culture. So how do you serve those people that you have identified within those cultures? Would you be able to serve them? Thank goodness for the internet. But how do we know that those sources are valid and is right, that someone's not trying to skew our thought processes? Who would we reach out to if we needed to work with a certain African culture? I work with the Maasai culture, which is part of Tanzanian culture. And I tell you, I would have no idea how to serve them at the end of life. I can provide good care for them, don't get me wrong, but their end of life rituals, could I touch a nail? I don't know. That is something I'm really trying to educate myself on, but that is a culture I'm going to talk about in a little bit, just in a few minutes. So I hope you're able to write down as many cultures as you can. I hope each of you have had at least 10. My students, I hope you have at least 5. But I want you to keep this in mind, because we're going to use it. Look at this culture. This is a gal that I met in Buni, Tanzania. It's a little tiny remote village in Tanzania near Arusha, and there is no address, so I couldn't even give you an address. But this gal is a Maasai villager, and she is one of the elders, and she is blind, and she is one of those individuals that when I look at her, I look at such grace and dignity, but how would I serve her at the end of life? What would that look like? Because she has a different language. I do not speak Swahili. My daughter went with me and she picked up very quickly how to speak Swahili, but we haven't used it. So I would need a translator. The communication, how would I know what she wants? Rituals, what is her role? She is the oldest individual in that community. How would I serve her? What is her values and thoughts? Because she has one, I'm assuming, and I'm assuming this, has one husband, but that husband has multiple wives. I saw that there. I mean, but I'm assuming she only has one husband. What was her practices? Her relationship with that gal right behind her is, she's her guide because she's blonde. And how would I serve her? Okay? So how would I serve you? The gal on the left, the man on the right. How would I serve these two individuals? Would I serve them in the same way? Would I just assume I'm gonna serve her like I do everyone else? Well, the gal on the left, I know nothing about. I got her off the internet. So, I mean, I would just have to try to ask her some questions, family questions. The man on the right is my father. I thought I knew how to serve him. And if you were at my presentation last year, you would see the same picture, because this isn't the picture of my dad when he was extremely ill. You can see he has a trait, and that he was able to he lost his voice box through cancer. He also has parts of lung inside him. He would never know that. Very hard time breathing, but he has this machine, as you can see in his pocket, is his machine of his ability to talk. That was his communication. So how would I communicate with the lady on the left? If she spoke a different language, praise God for Mercy Home Care and their translation services. I use that all the time. And I struggle with that though, because many times I'm like, how do I know that the information's getting across? But I have faith that God is doing that. My dad was he was a silent warrior. Oh man, he was the kindest man, and I miss him dearly. But without his voice machine, it was very hard for him to communicate. And the last thing he said is, you can do this now. I know you can do this. So that's why I am working with End of Life Dying right now, because he prompted that within myself to be able to work with the dying population. But I did not understand redemptive suffering. So when Cindy talked about redemptive suffering last night, and if you were able to hear about redemptive suffering last year in our presentation, it is so important that I was aware. I didn't know it at the time, but now I'm educated to help others. I've helped others go through that suffering and allow families to dual suffer with them and through their end of life journey. But honestly, as a daughter, I didn't know what my dad needed or wanted. And we just assumed. And it was absolutely maybe not what he wanted. So as a social worker that was on his case, didn't ask those questions either. He would not have a chaplain because he just really wanted his Catholic priest to be there with him. And at the time, the Catholic priest was changing, so he had one of the elders in our church come and work with him. But it was because of that situation, saying my dad's Catholic, and being through the end of life process, that I really wanted to teach others about the ability to serve Catholic patients at the end of life. Because I didn't know about Viaticum. I knew he needed to be anointed with oils, but when? And is it okay that it's not done the second before he dies? I was so turmoiled because of that. And it took me to get education myself to understand the process. Oops. So okay. Why is this important? Because culture can be defined in so many ways. Being aware of those differences and similarities between people without assuming value to that. It's important that as practitioners and as students, that we do not become stagnant in our care and provide universal care to our patients. And I sometimes feel I'm there. And that's when I am so excited about our monthly meetings, our monthly CEU events, because I think that's going to be a way for me to build more education and practice. Understand religion, spirituality, custom rituals, history, values, etc. My dear co-worker at Radcliffe University is Jewish, and my calendar has I put my calendar up for the Jewish holidays so I can support him in his holidays as well. Because there are times when I'm like, I know he's practicing alone. We're on a Catholic university, and I know that it just helps him to know that someone cares and someone understands. So I think we have to be able to understand the culture and build upon that. I'm going to tell a little story. I'm going to tell this quick. I was I was so mad one day. I was like, my son had a basketball game. I was off, and it was so important that I just get home. I got a call because we're in rural Iowa, and they saw on my GPS that I was closest to the patient who was dying, and it was so important that someone get with this individual. Well, I got there, and the person was in a comatose state. And again, I knew that I probably was going to be there 2 hours. Called my son, missed his game, no big deal. At the time, it was terrific, but he was in 8th grade, right? It didn't matter after the thought. So I was sitting there with this patient. She was all alone, had no family. And I was looking around the room like, what can I do? What can I do? I'm Catholic, and that at the time didn't even come to my mind. But I noticed a rosary. So I went to the nursery station. I said, is this person Catholic? They're like, well, yes. And at that time, we didn't have the digital communication. So I had to actually go into the file, look, and dig for like 10 to 15 minutes. So I started praying the rosary. The person was at the point of me finishing the rosary, and I'm very familiar with the rosary, so I was able to do that. I thought died. So I was like, oh my gosh, this person just died at the end of the rosary. What a spiritual experience for her and I. Literally at that second, I was gonna walk out the room and say, I think I need a nurse to call the death. She wakes up, looks at me, and says, thank you. Goes back down and dies. I still get goosebumps as I'm talking about it. It was probably the most spiritual end of life that I went through with somebody else. But me identifying the fact that she was Catholic, that rosary, that was the last thing she listened to before she died. And I say this to my husband, I hope I meet her someday when I go to heaven, to know just how, to see if it was as profound for her as it was for me. So let's look at the NASW cultural awareness and social diversity. And I'm bringing the NASW into this just because it really talks a lot about need for cultural diversity and the need for religion. Social workers should understand culture that functions in human behavior and society. We should have a knowledge base of our clients' cultures and the ability to demonstrate and be sensitive to those clients and cultures. Social workers should obtain education about and seek to understand the nature of social diversity. And a part of that oppression in respect to race, ethnicity. This is a part of who we are as a CSWNA. But the NASW, or NASW, really, I put that in bold here. It says that we need to have to be a part of that religion as well, and mental and physical disabilities. But today we're focusing on that religion. So that's when I pitched my pitch to our NASW president of Iowa. I said, hey, I want to do something on Catholicism. Do you care? She was all about it. She's like, Melanie, I think this is great. And I think that we need to really focus on some of those rituals so people can understand, because of where I live and where she lived, there was a lot of Catholic people. And so she's like, even if you're not Catholic, these are good things to be doing. So we're going to be building on the foundation of the NASW. It has developed standards. So they have the NASW palliative and life care. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I'm just saying that it's out there, and that it talks about palliative hospice, bereavement, grief care. And that could be controversial though as well, when you look at end of life and the respect for individuals to maybe withhold food and nutrition and hydration and such. So 2 talks about that knowledge. Social workers must demonstrate a working knowledge of theory and biopsychological factors essential to effective practice with clients and professionals. Must have knowledge about communication between those 2 clients and families. And we must be prepared with that systems theory, the family systems theory, and between and interdisciplinary team. This is just not, and I know Lynn did this, and she works this, and she's a director. This is not just, the ability to say that this is, our care, but we must know about the family systems, and we must know about the theories, and have that, interdisciplinary team building from not just the social worker, lens, but the medical, such as the nurse, CNA, volunteers, and then also the lens of the doctor. Have compliance and facilitating communication among clients, competence in integration of grief theories and interventions, pain management, collaboration of family dichotomies, just like we do with the Catholic social workers, and identify follow-up services as needed. And at the end of life care, hospice, and my aunt, my godmother just died, and I was just at a funeral last week, and I was talking to the family, and I said, do you realize you get bereavement care for up to 12 months and she's on hospice? They were not identified in that. And it was 2 weeks after the death. So it was just important, that they were identified, that their dad, who just lost his wife after 40-some years, could have someone come in and talk to him about the death. And they said, well, he has dementia. I said, it doesn't matter. He has every right to be able to have that service. And 9 talks of religion, cultural competence, and religion, and healthcare related beliefs and economic situations. Again, religion. So this is okay. This is right. This is what's just. This is what we have to have, that justice we need to promote as well. So I'm just gonna throw this out because I have used this resource in the past. The National Hospice Palliative Care Association, they have some websites, and Linnea's gonna talk a little bit about it, the NHPCO, because she's a little bit more aware about it, but they do have websites that talk about different cultures and how to deal or work with somebody at the end of life.
Also, before we go into that, just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Melanie was saying with our confidence. Again, and even as you go back to boundaries and you put all this stuff together that we're talking about today, boundaries, confidence, all of that goes and intertwines together, because it is our responsibility to make sure that people are aware of what services that we're providing to them. And sometimes as clinicians, we don't want to have the conversation about, and especially even, I'm going to just go from hospice because that's where I'm at, right? So especially in those circumstances where you go and you admit a patient and maybe they're not actively dying, but nobody wants to talk about the death. Nobody wants to talk about what's going to happen, as that disease progresses, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. Nobody wants to talk about, you will be having bereavement services for 13 months after your mom passes away. Nobody wants to have that conversation because it's uncomfortable, but it is the conversation that needs to be had, because here's a group of people that didn't even know they had a service, right? They thought the service was over. Grandma has died, now we're just moving on to life, right? But that's not what we do. So I think when you look at competence, whenever social work field you're in, it's so very important that you make people aware in the fashion in which they can be aware of what is happening within the services that are being provided to them. And maybe it's not having the conversation with the patient that has dementia or the family member that has dementia, but it's having conversation with the daughter to say, you know what, we're here for you even after your mom passes away. So you can probably tell that Melanie and I are both really proactive with bereavement. It's definitely a soft spot in our hearts, and I think a lot of times, that those services after the service just really kind of get blown over because nobody really wants to have the conversation of what it looks like when the inevitable does happen, when that person does pass away.
Okay, so Lenny, do you want to do a little bit on NHPCO just so people are aware of the website? Absolutely. NHPCO
NHPCO is a great resource for looking up information, you know, regarding end-of-life care. They have a variety of different things that you can look at. Sometimes you do have to be a member of NHPCO to be able to get that information a little bit more readily, or should I say free. But for those people that aren't NHPCO members, they do have a lot of information out there that really helps with a variety of different things, whether that has to do with, you know, outreach to different cultures, different ethnicities. But there is a lot of information. I'd encourage you to look that up. And Melanie has the slide here that allows you that opportunity to take that information and plug it into your URL and gather that information. But they do a lot of exploration and political work as well to help the you know, really the hospice industry continue to address end-of-life care needs for patients and families.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
So I think now we're gonna go into the NCBC.
Yeah, this is my I get excited when I talk about the NCDC and the ethical religious directive. So, and Linnea, I don't remember whose slide this is, but let's talk about it. So, the ERDs, Linnea and I both, and we're gonna say this, we were not aware of this until, is that true, Linnea? I don't want to speak for you, but I was, until, I mean, and we were seasoned practitioners, we're kind of proud of ourselves, right? And then we're like, oh, we have the ERDs. They, the ethical religious directives are part of the Catholic faith. They're directives set forth by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, and they really are the spearhead of Catholic healthcare. So also there's Catholic end-of-life documents I'm going to talk about, some of the sacraments, and again, I've done this presentation with individuals who are not Catholic, but are Catholic, or maybe just don't understand. So some of you, this will be extreme review, some of this will be new knowledge, and some of you, I hope to see something little out of this. And then last rites, how the verbiage, I've heard so many different ways of saying it, and it's just important that we identify that and redemptive suffering. We're going to go over that a little bit, but Cindy helped with that yesterday, so if we don't get to that, just so you know, it is something that Catholics should be aware of. The ERDs, what are these directives? They're excellent bioethics based on the moral principles of Jesus' teaching, and the ERDs are in 6th edition. So we were taught in the 5th, but there is the 6th edition. They're quite inexpensive. You would buy them at the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops website. And there are 2 full purposes. One to reaffirm ethical standards of behavior and healthcare that flow from the church's teaching about dignity of the human being. Again, that common theme, dignity of that human being, and provide authoritative guidance on certain moral issues that face Catholic healthcare today. So we use these as a way of being able to identify those ethical considerations in Catholic healthcare and how they are the guiding force. And this is all the way, like Linnea said, from the very beginning of life to the end of life. We're just going to focus a little bit on the end.
I think I want to, piggyback on what you said too. I get pretty giddy too in talking about the ethical and religious directives, and I think that the reason that I do is because it was so impactful for me at that point in my life when Melanie and I had the opportunity to go and be educated, so to speak, and go through was it like almost a whole year, 9 months worth of education, and learn about the ethical and religious directives. And I will tell you that can't speak for Melanie, but how much it impacted my practice, as well as my own spirituality and connection to my faith. And when we started that, you know, I think that, I don't know that I knew that that was maybe, needed a little enhancement, or not, but, what it has done, you know, for me, personally and professionally, you know, is definitely worth its weight in gold, because it has given me a different insight. It's given me a different way to look at things from not only just a broader perspective, but also from kind of a little pinpoint perspective. Because some things we don't think about the implications of just one thing. If we do one thing, sometimes we don't think about the other 17 consequences that came from that. So I think if you have the opportunity to really just kind of open your minds to the ERDs and think about them as we talk about, you know, obviously we can't go over all of them, or that would be another like 17 hours, but you know, we definitely, you know, want you to, if you have the opportunity to grab one of these and use the one that's maybe a little bit more specific for the clientele that you serve. But I tell you, the whole little pamphlet is definitely worth the time and the effort of getting it, to, I think, not only enhance you professionally, but also personally.
You know, and I also want to piggyback on that, Linnea, is that, you know, I have been, you know, Catholic school from elementary all the way up to my first master's, and I didn't know this existed. And if I did, I didn't like catch it. And so it was interesting too, because I'm like, this shouldn't be so hard. This shouldn't be so hard. I should know this stuff. And I then look at it, and I have studied many encyclicals in my first master's, and it just really complements. So it was perfect for me to do. It was very hard. I will say that the material for me to get, and I know you and I, Linnea, and we had a couple other people who were not Catholic, and there were times I'm like, well, how do they know this? Well, because you know what, it was fresh to them. And I had some views that I was brought up because my mom said this and my dad said this, and so it's kind of sometimes hard. Just want to throw that out. But the ERD, we talk about the social responsibility, the pastoral spiritual responsibility, professional to that patient relationship. So this is the CSWNA, right? I mean, this so complements the code of ethics of the CSWNA. Care for that beginning of life, care for the seriously ill and dying, that's what we're talking about, and collaborative arrangements with other healthcare organization providers, that cooperation and evil, and how we are expected to really know the organizations that we're collaborating with. And I take that to heart. There are times when I'm like, I seriously know that this is the only service out there that I can use, but you know, and such. So like, there are times when people will ask me about certain organizations, and I'm like, well, you know, they give to this organization, or they promote euthanasia. So where does my money go? I really try to be very conscious with that as well. So when we look at the issues in care for the seriously ill and dying, we look at informed consent. So it's like, I'm wondering if there was a social worker on some of this. I don't think there was, but you never know. Maybe the bishop that this morning, maybe he was a part of this. Moral obligations to preserve one's life for the person's benefit. Foregoing extraordinary and disproportionate means. I get so many people at the end of life saying, well, we have to do this, otherwise we're hastening their death. For example, my father, he was so against the do not resuscitate order. He's like, I want to be resuscitated. And that was something that I was like, okay. And I'm working in the hospice world, and Linnea can attest to this, there were many times that it's like, really, you used to weigh 100 or 250 pounds, and now you're 99 pounds. Because your body is, your core body is just wasting away because of the fact that your cancer is eating you up. Doing CPR on somebody like that, you're gonna crush your bones. But at the time, I was like, Dad, absolutely. And I couldn't understand why though. I was like, why do you want to be resuscitated knowing that this is cancer? And it was education. We both needed education at that time. But I also knew that he really thought that he needed to preserve his life in any way. And I think now with the education that I had, I would have been able to talk to him as his daughter and actually, probably get some consultation on that. But it was very, very interesting how that conversation kind of still comes up in my thought process as we talk about ERDs. Food and nutrition, when is it reasonable? When is it the burden versus benefit? Sometimes when you're doing artificial nutrition and hydration, it gets to the point where the body can't absorb it and you can see it even under their skin because it's not absorbing. When is that? When is it morally obligatory to provide that food and artificial nutrition and hydration? Look at euthanasia, it talks about that in ERD 60 and redemptive suffering, number 61. So let's talk about these end-of-life documents. We have a living will. So if you work like I do, I work with end-of-life people, individuals who are at the end of life or they're in home care. And part of my assessment is, do you have a living will or a medical power of attorney? Do you have that advanced care planning? And they'll say no, or they'll say yes. So every state is different when planning to have. And we have the I-Pulse, which has been kind of really talked about in a way that can be very controversial, but also complementary to end of life. But it's important that we know too that whatever state you have, that those pulses do travel between states, and it's important that they review them because maybe at the time when they were doing them, they had a different thought process or maybe different circumstances. So that's why they can be controversial, because sometimes it's like they don't review them, they're just, and then their thoughts change or their beliefs change. But a living will, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. Okay, the end of life documents set forth by the NCDC, and these are just some of the ones I would kind of point out to you because of the time. So we have the ERDs, and we showed you them, and so it's just, if you don't have them, they're cheap. I think it's important that you're aware of them, even if you're not Catholic. Some of my students, if you're my students and you're on campus, please come to my office and I will show you them. But also the Catholic Guide to End of Life Decisions. When my mother was having a stroke, the hospital asked me about these because I mentioned it. I was like, do you have a Catholic living will and advance directive? They're like, no. I'm like, oh, but maybe that's what she wants. And so I educated while I was in the hospital because I was the only visitor that could be with her for that whole entire week. And I was educating the nurses, the PTs, the OTs on this document. They're like, we didn't know it existed. I'm like, I know, right? Isn't this cool that you were able to be with me today? But the Catholic Guide to End of Life Decisions really talks about the redemptive nature of suffering, redemptive suffering. And if you're not aware of that, it's really, they're able to feel that pain and offer their pain and sacrifices up to Jesus, just like he did on the cross. Look at obligatory and actual moral needs for some of the resources, some of the techniques, some of the oh my gosh, I'm at a loss of words, situations between the moral obligatory and what is morally optional for the means to preserve life. So it gives that guide to these individuals. And so again, we don't want to have our own terms. So I have bought them, and I think if I'm right, and I could be completely wrong, but if you get into the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops and the National Bioethics Center, you can get the downloadable and such. So we can, like, I have it saved on my computer. Whoops. And so also the Catholic Guide to End of Life will talk about giving instructions for future care, talks about euthanasia, talks about moral teachings regarding ordinary and extraordinary care. And then it also has a glossary of terms. So it talks about the principle of double effect. What is the annoying genetic, which I'm going to go into next, advanced medical directives? What is, the definitions as pertains to the Catholic faith? Healthcare proxy, it might not be your spouse, it might not be your children, it might be some spiritual director that you may have. What is physician-assisted suicide, post-most, whatever they call it in your state? But it's important that you're aware of these documents and that these options for different end-of-life care documents are available. So I can't really show you right now, but A Catholic guide to end-of-life decisions at the very end will have a healthcare proxy document that you can use for your advance directive. And then also it has the advanced medical directive as well. And every state is different. I know that if I will offer this if I know the person is Catholic, or many times I'll just say, I have two kind of forms, the one in the state, you can get off the internet, but I also have one, and many people have used the Catholic one and such. So just wanted you to all be aware of that. So what are some of these rituals? Viaticum, I love this word, and I use this word and to educate because I was not aware of this word, and how could I not have been? Because I learned it, I'm sure, but it was probably, when we had to memorize and got good with memorization, so I probably just didn't connect it, right? And this is where I want you to connect it. Viaticum is that Eucharistic sacrament with ritualistic prayers at the end of life. That's number 16. So when my dad, ART 16, so my dad was dying, this is where I was so in spiritual turmoil. When does he get his final anointing? When do I call the priest? And COVID, it's even worse, right? Because when you might not even be able to get a priest to come in. And if you small town Iowa, sometimes they are able, but I just talked to my priest the other day, he goes, I have not been able to do this right I do it through the phone now, I think that's what he said, but he was able to go into a nursing home. They snuck him into the back door, and he goes, I felt like maybe I should be here. But during those specific hours of the day, the facility allowed guests to come in. And then there was a spike, we had to stop it. So even COVID, there's different rules and regulations. But anointing of oil, that can be done when it's sick and dying. And so with my father, he was able to have the anointing, the rituals at the end of life. And the priest at one point asked us all to leave the room. And then again, we were able to come in, hold hands, do a prayer, and he was anointed. So I asked the priest at the time when my father was dying, I'm like, how he cannot swallow? One, because he literally was dying, and I think he died the next day. How can he receive the Eucharist? And he said he can. And he showed me, he put a little bit of the Eucharist underneath his tongue. And my dad, I swear he knew, because his eyes just opened. He was in the state where his eyes were not closing at the time, very dry. But he had that movement, and I swear I saw a little bit of a smile. So if I would have known about all this, and my family wasn't Catholic, as devout Catholic as we are, maybe this wouldn't have happened. So if you have individuals who have no family members, this is something that's so important to know. Okay, let me go back here for a second. Lydia, do you want to add any more to that? I feel like I skimmed over that quite quickly.
No, I think that you hit it good. I mean, I think that a lot of times it's just that we need to make sure that we are good advocates for our Catholic patients and or any other religion, to be honest. If there are these end-of-life rituals that we are aware of, and I think that I can just coin what Melanie says too. It is amazing to me in our Catholic ran entities, whether they're hospital systems, hospices, or human services type fields that are affiliated with the Catholic Church, that they're just not even aware of some of these end-of-life rituals. And I think it's because they maybe just obviously don't know about it, but it is important that now that you're aware of it, you can be that much of a stronger advocate for people that your family, and use those opportunities, just like Melanie did, to educate people when you are in those settings that they can help them. And the next time that there is somebody in there or in their facility that needs a Catholic power of attorney or whatever, that now they know where to go.
And I want to piggyback on that, because I work for Mercy Home Health, which is a Catholic institute or a Catholic hospital. So I was signing all my forms, and I'm like, hey, because again, I was the VP of mission for a Catholic healthcare company. I'm like, hey, where's our education on ethical religious directives? And so I brought him in, and it's funny because they're like, do you want to do an education on it? I'm like, I would love to. So then life hits with my mom, and so I haven't been able to do it. But it's just so interesting because I challenge Catholic healthcare all the time. We're in the ERDs. So I know that Linnea and I, we worked with a really amazing Catholic healthcare provider in Omaha, Nebraska, Dr. Pierre, and he has the ERD, the ethical religious directive, sitting out in his waiting area. And he'll say, take whatever, and then he'll say, please keep this one in case if, people take the last one. But now with COVID, I'm sure they can't be out. But it's just interesting how if you challenge the healthcare system, that they're receptive to this, because administrators sometimes don't even know about this. Again, I've been educated in the Catholic faith for a very long time, and I was not aware. And it's okay though, because it's okay in certain circumstances, because that is, it might not be the knowledge that they were gaining at the time. So it's okay to challenge, is where I'm at. And it's okay to be that justice within the ethics compartment of healthcare to build upon that knowledge of others. Because I talk to ERDs all the time. And even in my education, I think it's important that my students know. So, redemptive suffering is the Christian belief that human suffering, when accepted and offered up communion of the passion of Jesus, can remit in just punishment for one's sins or for the sins of another. This is a very, very hard concept to understand for some, and some it's very easy. For me, it was extremely hard, and that's why Linnea and we were challenged by an archbishop in the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas, and his vicar general at the time to learn more about this. I will never forget that day we walked out to our cars, we're like, do you know what that term is? And she's like, no. And I'm like, I don't either. And I'm the VP of mission. And at that point, I knew a little bit, but we were challenging, and now we present on it. Because we both are just so in awe of this concept. We must look at diversity as a family, the individual is the family. We need to know about the power of attorney, the living will. Documents related to certain religions, like Linnea said, it's important. And my friends, I'm gonna say this, I was at a death one time, and Linnea was my supervisor. And I remember, if it wasn't for somebody kind of nudging me in the agency, we had a chaplain who was very knowledgeable of different cultures. He said, you are not allowed, Melanie, as a woman, to touch this body when you go in. I was like, what are you talking about? And it was a religion and that would not allow me to touch the body after the patient dies. And I got there, I had to wash my hands, do this whole ritual. And for me to even know what this religion is, I can't even tell you, because I didn't know the name at the time. But if it wasn't for the chaplain doing his education and educating me before I left, I may have hindered that individual's ability to do their end of life as they wanted to be on their journey. So it was interesting. I will never forget it. And I should probably go back and ask that chaplain what religion it was, because it was a religion I never heard about. Rights of autonomy for that individual. And this is where the family can be kind of different. The family might, and I might have Linnea kind of, because I know we're getting out of time here, but Linnea, I know you work with families that really put their religion before the individual's religion, and how do we handle that?
Oh, that is tough. I think it's through just a lot of exploration. There are those times where it is good to try to bring in someone, whether that be the priest or the pastor or deacon, but there definitely have been some very big struggles for me. I had a patient who actually was one of our volunteer coordinators, whose belief system through her church was that if you were good and just and you prayed enough, that God would save you. And so instead of going and seeking healthcare assistance for her breast cancer, she began to, continually, read the Bible, pray with her parishioners that would come and sit with her. And to the fact that then, 2 years later, of course, the breast cancer has grown so much that it is unable to, or inoperable, and was not able to do any more treatments because of that. And the one thing that we finally came to, because it was really, really hard for our staff, because one, it is our staff member, but secondly, it was really hard for our staff to understand, why would she do this? Why would she not go seek treatment? Why are these people there all the time? We're trying to provide care to her. And we had a moment, and I phrase it as a moment, because there was usually only about 10 or 15 minutes before other people from her church would be there, in between the times that we were there as hospice professionals, or other family members there. Their group of church members were very, very good to her, very, very good to her, and they're 24 hours a day. So again, just a moment, and she looked at me one day in her hospital bed, and she said, "I guess I am not good enough. I guess I am not good enough. I have not prayed enough for a miracle." And oh boy, it still tugs me today. And I remember looking at her, and I'm not even sure how it came out of my mouth, but I looked at her and I said, "Oh, Susie, maybe your miracle isn't here on earth." And I don't know why I said it that way. I don't know ever, and we sat there in silence after I said that. And I just, it is hard when other religions, other than what maybe you believe in or what other people believe in, but it is important to people. So it is important that we give people the information that they need to make the best decision that they can, dependent upon their beliefs and values, right? So if we can always be advocates for that growth of them, as long as, some people would say, well, that was still harmful to her. Well, but it's not harmful in her belief system, right? Here nor there, maybe emotionally harmful. But I don't know if that makes sense, but it definitely is a struggle when you have that diversity, or you have that family that's like, no, we don't believe in cremation, but yet the patient wants cremation, or, I want the priest to come, but maybe the patient doesn't want. Maybe the family has had a falling out with the church, but the patient hasn't, and the family's like, no, I don't want the priest to come because he knows I haven't been to church in 5 months, So it's, I think, really looking at and figuring out what are those options for the families. What do we do in that diversity to be able to at least give the information, and whether that information is received or not, unfortunately, isn't our decision, right? I don't know if that's what you were wanting or not, Melanie.
I think it's great. Thanks. Yeah. Let's see what we have next. We got through partner, and this is where I would go back to those cultures that you wrote down. Read at the cultures you identified earlier. How would you be able to serve that individual now? Would you have more kind of some knowledge, maybe, if they're Catholic, or if they're any other kind of religion? How would you go about finding those resources for those connections and such? So that's kind of where we're going to end. I don't know if we're open to any questions or if we can do that, but I just know that we have like 8 more minutes. I'm going to throw out, when we get back from lunch, that we are going to have Caitlin Bauer. She's a student of mine, so just so you know that will be happening after lunch.
Melanie, if you want, I can open all the mics, if anybody's got any questions, that way they can answer.
We hope we can.
Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, so I believe all they need to do now is unmute themselves if they have a question.
Anyone?
Well, I just want to say it's very informative and helpful, and I'm going to order some of those documents for my own family. Thankfully.
And that's
But,
why it's, I think it was Christmas presents.
Yeah, well, but, so very, thank you, guys. It was very informative and just valuable, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, what Bev had said, I think the other thing that is really good about the documents is it opens the opportunity to have the conversation. Sometimes we're looking for something to kind of go on to kind of have some of those uncomfortable conversations.
So I don't know what just happened, so I apologize. Can you hear me, Diane? Try to unmute that mic. There might have been something that got messed up. Okay, so little glitch, love computers. I'd like to thank you both, Linnea and Melanie. That was a very informative presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I know everyone else did also. We are going to take a lunch break, so we will be back about 1 o'clock. Okay, so the screen will go blank. There won't be anything on it. But we'll be back joining again at 1 o'clock, okay? Thank you very much, everyone.
Kathleen, can you?
Yeah. I hear somebody.
Hi, Kathleen, it's Ronnie San Nicolas. I just wanted to recommend to our audience also the advocacy in asking the priest to offer the apostolic pardon as part of the viaticum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.